Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Hey everyone, my name is Marit Stiles, and I'm running to be your premier. It is time for new people and for new ideas. And boy, is it so time for a change in Ontario.
This is Doug Ford's Ontario, and over the past 7 years, things have just gotten worse. So let's change it. I'm Bonnie Crombie, and I promise to do more for you.
And let's be clear, this isn't just about tariffs. The president has threatened economic force. He's even floated the unthinkable of taking over Canadian territory. Let me say this loud and clear, Canada is not for sale.
And they're off. After months of speculation, Doug Ford has pulled the plug on his government. Ontario is now in an election campaign. What's driving Ford's election call? What are the politics behind sending Ontarians to the polls early, amid ongoing fears of a looming trade war with Donald Trump and the United States? I'm David Smith. Today on The Big Story, we have our Ontario election campaign political panel. Joining me today, we have Andrew Brander, conservative strategist, vice president with Crestview Strategy, and former advisor to the Ford government. Hello, Andrew.
Hey.
Thanks for being here. And also we have Lindsay Maskell, liberal strategist, former advisor to Premier Dalton McGuinty. Hello, Lindsay.
Hello, David.
Thank you so much for taking the time. So, the race is on. It was not a well-kept secret. He had been hinting at it for months, and now it's here. Doug Ford has called a snap election in Ontario. Came as no surprise to most people, I think. So let's start with that first, the timing of it all. Doug Ford says he needs a new mandate, even though he has a big majority government already, and the next fixed election date wasn't until June of 2026, but he says it's all about dealing with Trump and the tariffs. He's promising to spend billions of dollars on support programs for people who might lose their jobs because of a trade war with the U.S. His opponents say that's baloney, and he's just doing it to lock up another 4-year majority government while he's riding high in the polls. And the PCs do have a large lead in the polls. So, Andrew, I'll start with you. Why are we having this election?
Well, of course, anytime you're ahead in the polls is a good time to call an election. To answer your question specifically, and the accusations of the opposition parties, is it baloney? Sure. And let's look at everything that's been happening for the last year in setting the stage for this early provincial election. Since Bonnie became leader about a year and a half ago, the Ford progressive conservatives have been pouring millions of dollars into advertising and trying to brand her. There was early budget consultations launched back in the fall. There was a delay in the return of the legislature. PC caucus had been told to announce if they were running again or not. Tories had started nominating their candidates. There was a flurry of recent announcements. All this to say, there was a whole lot of preconditioning for this election. So much so that, at this point, I don't think anyone was surprised when Doug Ford went to the LG to call an election. I would say the only thing that seems to have modified that timeline perhaps a little bit was the timing of a federal election. But in that preconditioning, Doug Ford really, really did a good job in terms of, I think, making people, sort of get over it. And so I don't think you're going to see, regardless of how much the opposition tries to push it, the issue of an unnecessary election or the cost of that election or the timing of that election become a salient issue throughout the course of this campaign.
Okay, fair enough. Lindsay, what do you make of the timing of the election? Are you buying Doug Ford's story that this is necessary? And do you think it's going to hurt him at all?
Well, if I was Doug Ford, I'd probably be doing the same thing. I think that the timing is interesting in the sense that it is very much about we're in a moment where incumbent governments are being voted out. Everybody that has had a second term is seen to be past their prime. And it's sort of a bit of the age of voter discontent. And there would be no better time to go now while there is still a federal Liberal government in Ottawa. That is the juxtaposition that the Ford government wanted. And the runway room for that was ending early. So, we're having a funny fact. We're having probably the first winter election in all of our lifetimes. It was well more than 40 years ago that we had a winter election. And I would say this, it is like everything with voters, it's going to be up to the voters to decide if they're going to be upset about Doug Ford calling an early winter election. And that's because of all of the things that you can't control through this next 27 days. Weather, whether or not we have a snowstorm, advanced polls on election day, whether Trump actually does go forward with tariffs or whether or not, there's a bit of a delay or a negotiation. He's watching this. The administration is watching this very closely. And so, whether this is being as a bit of a power move, do they do something different? Whether Ontarians actually think that they want a premier to step into the role of leading the fight with the U.S. or whether they think that does belong with our federal counterparts. So many things become out of your control when you flip the switch or have the writs issued and put it into the hands of the people. So that's what makes it so interesting.
Andrew, what will be the keys to success for the Conservatives, for Doug Ford, on defining the ballot question? Is it really about needing a mandate to fight Trump's tariffs? Is that really a primary provincial responsibility, more so than healthcare or education? What's the ballot question? How is he going to define that for people?
Yeah, it's yet to be defined, obviously, this early. But if you listen to the party leaders as they launch their campaigns, they're clearly looking at all the same issue polls, right? Each one of them are talking about the economy, jobs, housing, and to some degree, healthcare. So really, I think the ballot question is going to be certainly centered around that, but the nuances are all a bit different for each one of them, right? For Ford, it's one of protecting Ontario. What kind of leader do you want making those decisions around the economy, jobs, housing, healthcare? For Bonnie Crombie, she's trying to make it a referendum on Ford's scandals around these types of the same issue set, and quite frankly, what she's called sort of Ford's opportunism, and for Merritt, it's about trust and broken promises. Again, same issue set, but basically saying his promises aren't worth anything, and he'll say anything, in the pursuit of power and getting elected. What I can still pretty confidently say, despite what Lindsay just said, is I'm pretty sure the ballot question will not be on election day whether this was a necessary or unnecessary election, because voters really do come down to voting for themselves. If people do ultimately feel that the election was unnecessary, what you're going to see then is just a lack of engagement. But they're not going to go out and vote against someone because of that.
Okay, interesting. So, Lindsay, I thought it was interesting when we saw Bonnie Crombie, the Ontario Liberal leader, launch her campaign yesterday. It was very healthcare forward. She was at a hospital. She was joined by a past president of the Ontario Medical Association for her campaign launch. They both fielded questions together. She was hammering home on the healthcare file. 2 million Ontarians don't have access to a doctor. Really trying to put healthcare front and center on the first day of the campaign. What do you think the strategy is there? I think it would be fair to say that for a lot of Ontarians, if you take Trump and tariffs out of the equation, a top issue for most people in a provincial election has got to be healthcare because the situation is so bad right now. So is that a winning message? What do you make of what you saw from Bonnie Crombie's Liberal Ontario campaign launch yesterday?
Yeah, that's exactly right, David. They need to position, you can't just campaign on somebody else's mistakes. You have to have a forward offer. And there are, millions of Ontarians without a family doctor. And the people have felt a big crunch. Yes, what's happening with the US and the border, all of this is very important. But at the end of the day, when you look at core provincial issues and voters are fronted with having to make a choice, the opposition is well versed in their time to be spending it on talking about the current situation of lack of family doctors, people's experience in the emergency room, surgical wait times, these things that are a core on the province to deliver and to deliver well. In addition, I think we should probably see, maybe Merritt more than Bonnie talking about housing. Every level of government has jumped in on the housing file as it became a crisis and everyone needing to be seen to be responsive to it. But our Constitution does make it front and center a provincial issue. So even though the increase in our population may have been driven by some federal immigration issues, this is still a provincial issue. And the person calling an election and having people go to the ballot box is the first one that has to sort of answer for some of these issues. So I'm happy to see that people are going to be driving not just a conversation about Trump, because we are only like 8 days into this administration. So I think we have to be looking at a bunch of issues affecting Ontarians, and so this will be the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, Andrew, how much do you think Ford can resist the urge to respond to attacks against him personally, against his record? How critical will message discipline be in a campaign like this? Just stick with where your strength is, which is on the Trump file. Only talk about that. Trump, 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 tariffs, 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 all day long until we get to February 27th. Is that the strategy?
That's absolutely the strategy. I think you're also going to see that he has the advantage in that, because the fact of the matter is with such a short timeline to conduct a campaign like this, and with the early start, it's really left everyone sort of scrambling in terms of not just the leaders and their tours and the daily messages that they want to put out and that kind of planning. But also, even in the coverage itself, right? You're leaving a whole bunch of like wide open space for anyone to sort of move in and fill that space. So for Ford, I think you are going to see that strategy of him sort of campaigning in a bubble, if you will. He's going to do a lot of things and a lot of his campaign outside of major media markets. He's going to spend a lot of time up north. Halfway through the campaign, you're going to see him go down to DC and join the other premiers and probably take the Queen's Park Press Gallery with him. It's going to be really hard for the opposition parties to sort of compete with that kind of coverage. And I'd agree, which is his biggest risk is being sort of thrown off his message in response to something that Bonnie Crombie's talking about or something that Merritt Stiles is talking about. And that's why already from day one, you've seen him framing this as a election of Ford versus Donald Trump. He wants you to completely forget about the other two and really face the opponent who, quite frankly, would shock all of us if Donald Trump took a moment of his day to even think about responding to Doug Ford's attacks.
Yeah, you're so right. There's only so much oxygen, and Doug Ford and Donald Trump are both people who take up a lot of oxygen in and of themselves. Lindsay, for Bonnie Crombie, for the Ontario Liberals, she's the newcomer to this whole race, doesn't have a seat in the legislature. How much is name recognition going to be a hurdle for that campaign to get over in the early days here? I mean, I saw there were many pieces with reporters on the street on the day of the campaign launch, asking people if they knew who the Ontario political party leaders were. And yeah, everybody knows Doug Ford. Not a lot of people seem to know who Bonnie Crombie is. So how do you overcome that?
Yeah, and I mean, outside of the GTA kind of 905 area, that is for sure true. And I think even harder for Merritt Stiles because, look, Mississauga is the fourth largest city in Canada. Had a large number of people that have had to vote or vote against a Bonnie Crombie before. But there's also a lot of content of Doug Ford praising Bonnie Crombie as the mayor of Mississauga. The interesting thing I think of this election, and this may be particular to me, but it would be a mistake for media to ignore something really interesting about this election, which is that there are two women party leaders. And Doug Ford needs to take that seriously in terms of trying to make it seem like they're not even part of this race would be a strategic error. And I think it's an interesting moment to see how these three party leaders will debate, will talk about national issues, will talk about healthcare. And it could be seen to be, if you're just focusing on Trump and not thinking that you're talking to Ontarians and that are in the race that is in their homes and the things that affect them in their day-to-day lives, that you could miss the mark. It could come across as arrogant, which, former Premier David Peterson gave some wise words and wisdom about this weekend in a rare media interview. So I think you have to be very careful about being respectful about the race and time that we're in with the people that are your opponents. And I think that they'll be having to do they'll have to think about this differently than they have any other election.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up David Peterson. I was going to throw that at you guys and see what you think. Seen a lot of people bringing it up. The parallels are there. So that's the 1990 Ontario election. I don't want to make anyone feel old. That was 35 years ago. You had a premier in David Peterson, had a majority government, called a snap election. He was 20 points up in the polls, and he lost. He lost the election entirely to Bob Rae, who formed Ontario's first and only NDP government. Andrew, what do you think?
Well, look, the decision is not without risk. Lindsay already talked about the fact that, if we look globally, last year, every incumbent government that faced election saw them lose a share of their vote. They didn't necessarily lose the election, but they lost a share of the vote. If we look provincially across Canada last year, same thing. Only outlier on that was Tim Houston in Nova Scotia. So there's absolutely reason to pause. There's absolutely reason to think about this. However, I'd still argue, and Lindsay talked about this earlier as well, in terms of the timing being, within Doug Ford's control. Let's talk about the things that fall out of your control if you're not controlling the timing. He'd almost certainly get locked in to the fixed election date next June. And that comes with it more than a year of Trump's tariffs and the impacts of that. Another year for Bonnie Crombie or Merritt Stiles to, quite frankly, do anything to move their numbers. And it could very well come about a year after a Poilievre government. which has promised a number of significant spending cuts, which could include cuts to, the provincial transfers and other things, a whole lot more outside of Ford's control at that point. So for the factors that you can control, I think it's still we're going to reflect on this decision and not be able to draw the comparisons to the Peterson decision.
Okay, we have to address this. This is a really important part of the whole political picture here. And Lindsay, I'll start with you. How does a Pierre Poilievre government in Ottawa change the political calculus for Ford in Ontario? And what I mean by that is, how does the specter of an upcoming federal election, which Poilievre is poised to win, at least at this point, how has that influenced the timing of the Ontario election? Why would Doug Ford want to have an election in Ontario before there's a federal election?
Well, political scientists like to talk about the Frank Underwood theory, which of course is that we do not like the same party in Ottawa that is sitting in the provincial legislature in Ontario, and that we somehow regulate ourselves to always having an opposing provincial and federal party. I don't buy into that quite as much as it is that it's easier, when you think about the last number of campaigns, people have been, it would be very convenient to campaign against the things that the federal government has done, have a enemy in a federal Liberal government that doesn't exist with Bonnie yet, right? So basically, if you're campaigning against the Liberals, there is a current climate that people are angry at the federal Liberal government. And so that is who you would want as your opposition, that combination of that plus Donald Trump. But I would say this, the timing of it is interesting if you're looking at it from that perspective of just getting ahead of having Pierre Poilievre in, and people then maybe not liking that risk or not liking that direction. I just would like to remind people that when we went through an economic crisis, after 08-09, Dalton McGuinty did end up running a third term and went from very behind in the polls to winning a third term by showing a steady hand on the wheel, and that why you would want a stable government with a proven record in those difficult times. So, it's a bit of a calculated risk. I think that a Poilievre government is also difficult for Doug Ford because I don't think it's a well-kept secret that they are not well aligned on some things. So it would be a different type of opponent, and it's a very convenient time to do this now, while also lots of campaigners are occupied with a federal Liberal leadership. So there's just less gas in the tank with the resources being spread out.
Yeah, and Andrew, to flip it around and phrase it in a different way, how does having Justin Trudeau / the Liberal Party of Canada in power federally help Doug Ford and the PCs politically?
Well, it certainly does to a great degree. I mean, Bonnie Crombie is going to some pretty great lengths to try to distance herself and differentiate herself from the federal Liberals. And certainly it's a steep hill for her to climb. As I mentioned earlier, the Tories have literally spent millions of dollars on advertising campaign now for over a year, talking about sort of that relationship. So certainly advantageous for Ford to be putting that option out there, while the Trudeau brand and memory, if you will, is still strong and center of mind for voters. That could change despite exactly what Lindsay said. There's certainly no love lost between Pierre and Ford. They will be each making their own decisions in terms of what's best for their respective coalitions. However, having said that, if Ford were to be facing this, a year after Trudeau was long gone and out of recent memory, I think Bonnie might have stood a much better chance at being able to sort of separate and differentiate themselves. So I think that's a huge advantage for Ford, and certainly went into the calculation on timing.
Okay. I think we'll close with this. If we're looking at this election, the scenarios, Lindsay, I'll start with you. What do you think the Ontario Liberal Party would consider a win in this election? Do you think are they looking at trying to form a government? Is that realistic for them? Would a win being official opposition status? What do you think some of the goalposts are?
Well, first of all, it's I would say a main goalpost would be getting party status back. Right. That should be the first benchmark. What do you do to secure that number of seats? I do think kind of hopefully regulating back to that position of being, the next benchmark would be official opposition. But you only do a campaign to win a campaign. You have to have a strategy, a seat-by-seat strategy with different scenarios, and be able to scale up and escalate to be able to go with the feel and what's happening in a campaign and the temperature. So having that scalable strategy to continue to move through those benchmarks should be the goal. It is a very challenging election, and I think they are realistic about that. There's lots of things, and we should all say something nice about our opponents. So I will say there's been lots of good things that have happened, particularly for working people in Ontario. And so there is, I think it's an uphill challenge, but this is going to be a real important opportunity for them to basically need to come back and reinstate as sort of the main party. That we have always had a third party system, but the NDP being government and opposition as a one-time thing would be the one place to regulate back to. But at the same time, you're in a campaign to win it.
And Andrew, from the Conservative perspective, what would be a win for them on what do you think a result would be where the PCs would take a look at all of the money and the resources they've spent trying to define Bonnie Crombie and cut the legs out from under that campaign before it begins? What result would they look at and say, that was worth it? We got a good return on our investment.
A win, David. And so I look, governments are very cyclical in nature, right? And so if we fast forward 4 years to the end of this term, Doug Ford will certainly be very will have passed that 10-year mark that you obviously see very often as the sort of expiry date for government. So quite frankly, as Lindsay said, you call an election to win it. The Premier has said very clearly he is asking for the largest mandate he's ever been given. I think that's going to be pretty difficult given the sort of relatively historic result he got in the last election. And quite frankly, I'm not sure they actually believe that there's a path to that internally in the war room. I think the reason why he's asking for that, the reason why he's saying it, is because they know that the biggest risk to Ford in this election is voter apathy for all the reasons we talked about. Winter election, cold out, assumed conclusion that people think that they know how this election's going to end, as well as the whole other bunch of issues we talked about in terms of the opposition parties not really resonating, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So their biggest risk is obviously members of Doug Ford's voter coalition who just decide to sit this one out and stay at home.
All right, look, it's been a lot of fun speaking with you guys today at the outset of this campaign. I know a lot's still up in the air, so I really appreciate you taking the time to join the show and weigh in on all of the many unknowns, and hopefully we can check in with you throughout the campaign as we get closer to heading to the polls February 27th. Lindsay Maskell, thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
And Andrew Brander, it's been a pleasure today. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, David.
Again, that was Andrew Brander, conservative strategist with Crestview Strategy in Toronto, and Lindsay Maskell, liberal strategist, former advisor to Premier McGuinty. That was the big story for today. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode. Email us hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on any of your other favorite podcast platforms. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm David Smith. Thank you for listening.